Welcome insiders to our virtual coffee shop. I brought, actually in full disclosure, I don't drink coffee, so I brought my tea. However, Justin Rivers here is a real expert on coffee, and he leads our Greenwich Village coffee tour on normal times. So we've asked him to present to us some of what's on the tour, but also some of what doesn't make it on the tour. If you know Justin, he goes down rabbit holes and deeply researches everything there is possibly to know about a given subject. And so a lot of it doesn't necessarily make it into an hour and a half or 2-hour tour. So we're excited to have him share some of that with us now. Justin, are you full screened? Maybe you need to hit me. Okay, anyway. All right.
Could I come back and show my face?
We'll take it away.
All right. Yeah, I'll keep it up because what I think we'll do is we'll talk a little bit for about a half hour about coffee, the history of coffee, coffee culture in New York, because a half hour is not enough time, but we're going to fly right through it. And then we'll drop the screen and we'll drop the mutes and we'll have a conversation. You could do a Q&A with me, or you could just talk about your favorite blend. I already noticed somebody who was on the tour said that he was drinking his blend from Puerto Rico, which is where this initial picture that you see up on your screen is from. We'll talk a little bit about Puerto Rico now. Our tour, the tour that we give in real time, is Greenwich Village based, and it's 90 minutes, and we cover a lot of ground, 4 stops. And as Michelle said, I put together about 65 pages worth of notes and probably 12 hours worth of material, and none of it ever gets into the tour. So this is a good chance to talk a little bit more about it. So let's just go ahead and start. The picture that you are seeing, that is a coffee, or a collection of coffee seeds. Now, we call coffee beans. And they are not beans. And actually, we call that form a cherry, sometimes coffee cherry, which is more correct. That flesh around the seed inside is called mucilage. So what you do is when it's ripe, when they're red, you peel that flesh aside and you get the what we call coffee bean, but it's actually a seed. Now, what you're seeing here is sort of a color spectrum of how seeds sort of ripen from very green as they first grow to almost like a deepish purple when they're just about ready to fall off of the coffee tree. As coffee consumers, we basically consume 2 types of coffee, although there are about 100 varieties, Arabica and Robusta. And so Robusta is what we were probably drinking more like 10 to 15 years ago when you bought a can of roasted Folgers or more on the market brands. And then Starbucks and more specialty coffee shops brought us to sort of more of an Arabica, which is definitely a lot more delicate, a lot more subtle. They're grown in 2 totally different areas. Robustas are more low, hot, humid, wet climates, and Arabicas are more high and dry climates, which accounts for the different tastes that we get. So one of the things I do try to do on the tour when we start is talk a little bit about the mythology of how coffee was discovered. Now, coffee as a beverage, as opposed to tea, does not have that long of a history. Tea is very ancient, thousands of years of history. Coffee sort of comes onto the scene about a couple hundred years after the birth of Christ. So, you know, AD, you've got about 500 AD is when we start discovering coffee. Now, there are 2 founding myths to coffee, but it's basically been accepted that Ethiopia is the birthplace of coffee. So this photo here, or this drawing rendering, is of Kaldi the goat herd, who was an Ethiopian, obviously not very well represented in this mid-19th century drawing, but Kaldi was from the Harar region of Ethiopia, and he had his goats out in the fields. And the goat, one of his goats, comes upon a coffee tree and starts nibbling on the seed. And of course, the goat starts dancing because he got all caffeinated. So Kaldi himself goes and tries the bean. He loves it. He starts dancing with his goats. Now you'll see the guy in the back who's approaching Kaldi. That's supposed to be a monk from the Gari tribe. And the monk was like, ooh, this is evil, dancing and fun, maybe not so good. But he tries the bean, he takes it back to his fellow monks, and they realize that the caffeine in the seed uh, helps them to pray all night. So actually, this is great. This is obviously ordained by the gods. Now, there is a dual founding myth, which actually comes from the Arabian Peninsula. And that gentleman is Omar. And the story behind Omar was he was a Sufi in the Arabian Peninsula making a pilgrimage, most likely to Mecca. And Sufis were not generally loved by the Islamic community uh, always, and because they were a little subversive, they were mystics. And he was sent out to the desert to starve. But that bird, which you see perched on the tree, brought Omar to the coffee trees, and that saved his life. He basically sustained himself off of coffee seeds. And this is sort of the founding myth that's gotten buried. If you sort of Google general coffee founding myths, they'll go to Kaldi and the goat herd in Ethiopia. But if you go to Australia, Australia has a chain of coffee shops called Omar and the Marvelous Coffee Bird, which this is actually a shop called Omar and the Marvelous Coffee Bird. These illustrations are from a seminal book about coffee's history. It is called All About Coffee by William Euchers. It is a great resource if you want to learn more about coffee history in general, world and New York. You can get it PDF'd online actually for free. It's, I believe he wrote it almost 80 years ago now. So in the tour, I start on Minetta Street. Actually, I very, very specifically, to some people's chagrin, say the Minetta Triangle as opposed to Minetta Playground or Minetta Park, because the Minetta is the beating heart still sort of Greenwich Village. It always was. And it's a great place to begin a coffee tour because Minetta Brook, which was known to be teeming with trout, was also a sort of brackish water source for the initial settlers who settled Greenwich Village. So at first, you get into it, Wilhelm Kieft, third director general, has a plantation up there for tobacco. He's the one who gives it the term Grenwec, which means the Green Ward. And then they start, the Dutch actually start freeing their slaves because they can't feed them and encouraging them to settle up in the Washington Square Park area, Greenwich Village area, so that they create a buffer between the natives and the Dutch down still south of Wall Street. And you get a very rich tradition of African-American settlement, so much so that the Minetta was called the Negroes Causeway because what they did is they boarded it up to walk over it. But when the New Amsterdammers came in the 1620s and 30s, they had something, their breakfast beverage was something absolutely disgusting called must. It actually even has a disgusting name. And must was a really watered down version of beer. Because the Dutch were getting their drinking water from sources that were brackish and a lot of times dirty, they had to boil it and ferment it to make it drinkable. 1640s, you get two really huge changes in beverage consumption in New York / New Amsterdam, one of which is the first tavern opens in 1641, and of course, nothing's ever the same to this day. But then secondly, coffee is brought over from the Dutch Asian holdings in Jakarta, and coffee becomes the warm breakfast beverage of choice, which is, and then again, nothing's ever the same after that. So, okay, taking a page out of Steve Duncan's book, one of the things I do on Minetta Street is I flash a flashlight down into the sewer so that we can see the Minetta Brook still running under our feet, and there is a picture of it. So what you're seeing here are antique sort of relics of colonial coffee consumption in New York. So what would happen is coffee was sold in its green unroasted form down in lower Manhattan off the backs of boats and in coffee markets. Mainly women, housewives would go and buy it. They'd bring it home and in their hearths, they would roast it. And so what you're seeing in the center with the long stick attached to it is actually a roaster. That thing would open, you'd throw the beans in, and you would arduously turn it over the fire until they were roasted. Now, the sign to know that it was pretty much done was the seeds, well, they are seeds, the beans would pop. And that's how you knew they were just about roasted. Now, one pop meant you got sort of like a medium roast out of it. If you let it go 2 pops, you would get a darker roast, which is what I actually like more. And then they'd empty the seeds into like a mortar and pestle, which is what you're seeing on the left-hand side. And then they would grind it down and then throw it in their cooking pots. So one of the things I came across when I was doing my research was New York women would actually throw the ground coffee into the pots they used the night before. So your coffee sort of had a flavor of whatever you made for dinner the night before, which is kind of gross to think about. But hey, listen, it was a necessity. Now, what was the coffee that they were drinking like? It was much like very strong, syrupy Turkish coffee. And the Dutch and the English colonists would heavily season it with cinnamon, cardamom, and then whatever sweetener they could find, mainly honey. So it had a very syrupy, thick taste to it. This is a picture of the first coffee house, a depiction of the King's Arms. That's New York's first coffee house. Some actually say it's America's, but there is apparently a rival coffee house which showed up a couple years earlier in Boston. Now, the King's Arms was built between Cedar Lane and Trinity, somewhere in between that point on Broadway itself. I have a description here from Euchre's. He said the King's Arm was built of wood and had a front of yellow brick, said to be the brick brought from Holland. On the roof was an observatory arranged with seats and a commanding view of the bay, the river, and the city. Here, the coffeehouse visitors frequently sat in the afternoons. Before the front door hung the sign of the lion and the unicorn fighting for the crown. For many years, the King's Arms was the only coffee house in the city. So what you're seeing here is a very early depiction of the coffee house, which was most likely a Dutch home before it was bought and turned into the coffee house, and they added that observatory on the top deck. Now, interestingly enough, before I talk about this coffee house at Wall Street, women were not allowed in coffee houses. It was basically a man's drink and a man's place to enter. If a woman came, she had to be escorted by a man. We'll talk a little bit about that because that sort of doesn't change until the late 19th century, which is kind of shocking. But now this is a shot of the corner of what was called Queen Street, but what we know today as Pearl, and Wall Street. And so the building that I want you to take notice of is actually on the right side. It's the largest building in view. It's got the terrace around the third story. That is the Merchant's Coffee House. Now, this is New York's second biggest coffee house, and it is an important spot in American history that most of us do not know. Before I talk about that, vantage point is looking down at the East River from Wall Street, where those ships are docked. But the Merchant's Coffee House is basically where the Sons of Liberty met and decided in 1774 that they should start a little thing called the Continental Congress. The birthplace of the Continental Congress was in a coffee house in New York at this spot. And it was there that they had sort of decided what the particulars were for the Boston Tea Party, so on and so forth. But most amazingly enough, I just love this when I found this out because I didn't know until I did the research. On April 23rd, 1789, President-elect George Washington, the first place that he is recognized as President of the United States, is at the Merchant's Coffee House. And this is actually a depiction of it. You will see Washington showing up. The coffee house is the building, again, with the terrace and the bunting, and everybody's standing on it. The troops are behind him. I know it's kind of hard to see. It's a very scratchy black and white, but Washington is basically the guy in the white pants with the sword towards the right side. And this is him being first recognized as president at the Merchant's Coffee House, where back then it was believed the revolution was born. So coffee houses extremely important, not only in New York history, but also American history. Now, this painting on the left-hand side, you'll see, again, you've got sort of like an elevated terrace. You've got people standing on it, the flag on the top of the building. This is the corner of Wall and Pearl from the other perspective, across the street. This is the Tontine. And the Tontine Coffee House was built in 1792. And why it's so famous is it was the first bricks and mortar home of the New York Stock Exchange. The New York Stock Exchange was born about a year before under a buttonwood tree across the street in Wall Street and really didn't have a home until it settled in the Tontine Coffee House. I have a little quote here which explains it pretty well. The Tontine Tavern and Coffee House is a handsome, large brick building. You ascend 6 or 8 steps under a portico into a large public room, which is the Stock Exchange of New York, where all bargains are made. Here are 2 books kept, Lloyd's of London, and every ship's arrival and clearance. This house was built for the accommodation of the merchants by tontine shares of £200 each. So then basically tontine was where you came to do all of your business. Second floor was where you would do your business, and then you'd go upstairs to the upper floors to drink coffee and have further meetings. So all of industry, economy, and even politics in New York throughout most of its early history was conducted in a coffee house. Now, who is this guy with that very, very impressive goatee? That is Jabez Burns. So up until about 1863, coffee is bought in its green form by merchants. It is then brought home to be roasted by housewives until this guy comes around and he says, you know what? There has to be an industrialized way that we could roast coffee. Instead of putting it in those little baskets, turning it over fires or open flames, he gets a patent for the first large batch roaster. And that's actually a picture of it. You see the funnel is where you could put about 4 burlap sacks full of green coffee into that roaster. It would turn the coffee for you, and it would allow you to try a sample of the bean. So instead of stopping the whole process, opening whatever you have up, disturbing the roasting process, you could get a bean or 2 to figure out if it's where you want it to be right at your roasting blend. And of course, this changes the game for coffee production in New York. Coffee now becomes not only an industry of buying and selling the green coffee, but now Lower Manhattan is officially called the Coffee District, mainly around the seaport, all the way wrapping around Battery Park. Most of about 50 to 60% of the ships coming in to Lower Manhattan at this time are carrying coffee somewhere in their stores. That is a picture of a smaller batch Jabez Burns and Sons roaster. As a matter of fact, if you go online today, you yourself could order a Jabez Burns and Sons mini roaster for your home or business. They are still in business in some form. And that's the insignia. You know that it's a Jabez Burns, the original. So when you begin to roast coffee, now you have, much like the Havemeyers in Williamsburg were refining sugar, now you've got big companies roasting coffee. And these guys, the Arbuckles, John Arbuckle from, not Garfield's father, by the way, John Arbuckle from Pittsburgh, comes and starts Arbuckle's Coffee. Now, they are buying coffee, they're roasting coffee, and they did something revolutionary at the time in the late 1800s. They put it in little bags so that you could buy it in small individual packets, which was brand new, because if you wanted to buy coffee, even if it was pre-roasted, you had to buy huge burlap sacks of it. Now, much like we go to the grocery store and buy roasted coffee, the Arbuckles introduce what they call their Ariosa coffee. And you'll see the stats on this postcard, how many pounds they're roasting daily. And again, they changed the game. Now, where was their production facility? J Street. Most of Dumbo was devoted towards their coffee production. Most of the waterfront of Dumbo was Arbuckles for a very long time. This is actually a colorized postcard of the roasting facilities in the Arbuckle plant. As you can see, there is a gentleman scooping up large amounts of roasted coffee out of those industrial roasters, all in a row. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of coffee roasted a day. Love this picture. So if you've been to Dumbo and you've walked around Empire stores and you've gone to some of the remnant industrial sites there, at one point they were probably purposed for Arbuckles or for coffee production. Here is a picture of coffee coming out in burlap sacks out of the bays onto the carts, where it's either being loaded in to roast or loaded out to be shipped. This picture is a depiction of the New York Dock Company Bush Terminal docks, which would be further south on the Brooklyn waterfront. The New York Dock Company had an incredible amount of cubic footage to store coffee, 44 million cubic feet in those warehouses, 34 piers. And at this point, New York is the dominant port of trade for coffee, importing and exporting at this point. Of course, we're not growing coffee anywhere in New York, but we're bringing it in from other locations. We are roasting it and we're selling it across the country. The only other two cities at the time that could even come close, and they weren't even as close as we were, was New Orleans and San Francisco. So here's a shot inside one of those New York Dock Company facilities. As you could see, thousands upon thousands of pounds of coffee being loaded in trains of guys just sort of lifting it off of the carts into the storage areas. An amazing amount of cubic footage devoted to green and then roasted coffee. This is I'm such a nerd for, remnants and all this stuff. So this is a Google map shot of the Bush Terminal piers. So again, if you look back real quick at that depiction and then look at the Google map, you'll see where Bush Terminal Piers Park are on the sunken remnants of where all of that coffee was being brought into. You could sort of see under the water and sort of popping right above the surface, the remnants of those piers, now mostly devoted to park space. Not too far away, the Brooklyn Army Terminal during World War II was one of the largest coffee roasting facilities in the country because they were roasting coffee for all of our troops overseas. It is also later invented instant coffee, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the most fascinating by far and greatest find that I found in coffee, especially New York coffee history, was this woman right here, Alice Foote McDougall. Now, remember, I told you coffee was very, very much a man's game. And then this woman comes onto the scene, and boy, does she change that very quickly. Her story is awesome. So she is actually born pretty well heeled. She is the granddaughter of one of New York mayors in the 1820s. She's born in one of those great Greek Revival homes along Washington Square Park North. And then her father, who was in steel, sort of loses his riches. She quickly gets married off to a coffee merchant who then loses his riches and then dies on her, leaves her with 2 sons and no money. And she's with that firecracker New York spirit that we see so many times in New York history. She says, well, I'm going to take over my husband's business. I'm going to change the name. I'm going to call it A.F. McDougall's, dropping Alice because she doesn't really want people to know she's a woman because it's never been a woman's game. She does okay, but she decides that maybe if she wants to become more of the central image for this enterprise, she needs to go into retail. So what she does is she opens a coffee whole bean purveyor inside Grand Central Terminal in the Lexington Avenue Passage. It's called Little Coffee Shop. And she's selling whole bean and roasts that she's doing all on her own. She's doing okay until one February afternoon. It's a really bad nor'easter blowing through New York. We all know what those are like and how rough it is. And she sees these commuters coming into Grand Central. The year is 1919, by the way. And she says, these poor guys need something hot to drink and something to eat. She's not brewing coffee yet. She's just selling whole beans. So she does something completely radical. She brews the coffee. She tells one of her shop girls to go to her house quick and get a waffle iron. So she starts mixing up waffle batter. And that day she starts selling, with every cup of coffee bought, you get a free waffle. This literally takes fire so quickly she can't keep up the demand. She keeps changing the formula. She goes, free waffle with every cup of coffee, free cup of coffee with a waffle. And she makes hundreds of thousands of dollars doing this. And she builds what becomes a huge coffee empire. For 2.5 years, that shop, you can't even get into it in Grand Central Terminal. She decides, I need to take a break. She goes to Italy. She comes back and she's inspired to start these, which are a whole chain of Mediterranean-style coffee houses where you could come, get coffee, eat. They are described, they're basically mainly, by the way, in the Upper East Side and Upper West Side. Quote, they are the paradise of the Uptown Bridge Club, the prosperous Brooklynite, the suburban shopper, the eager sightseer from the hinterlands. That was before we had the term bridge and tunnel, by the way. Ladies, substantial and ambitious for better things, whose digestion is aided by a little culture. And these things are hot as hotcakes. People love them. They were crowded. And she becomes this Martha Stewart-like mogul in New York coffee scene. She has cookbooks, pictures of her all the time. Here's a picture of her from one of her cookbooks sitting beside a very elegant coffee setting. Her favorite mode of making coffee was percolation. And this is how she used to write to women. She'd say, quote, "Coffee is a sensitive being. It has whims and its fancies. And you, lady housewife, must guard the morals of your coffee as you do your children's, or your breakfast table tomorrow will be a place of wrath." Now, what was great about Alice Foote McDougall was she had a library of cookbooks written by her hand. The woman never stepped into a kitchen ever in her life. She had no idea how to cook. So you'd look at these recipes and they literally were just lists of ingredients. They wouldn't tell you how to do anything with them. But she, unfortunately, the Depression hit and she lost most of her money and died in 1947. Um, and she is buried in a very inauspicious grave up in Woodlawn. Now, from that tradition of whole bean purveyors on the tour, we stop at the oldest whole bean purveyor, which is McNulty's on Christopher Street, open since 1895. The McNulty brothers were Irish immigrants. They came, one was a judge. It was in the family until the 1980s when they sold it to the Wong family, who still work there today. What's great about this place is it's just lost in time. It feels like 1895 when you walk in there. That scale is one of the originals. When we go inside, you know, guests have likened it to being inside a shop in Harry Potter. Their coffee selection is good, but I always say wait to Puerto Rico, which we'll talk about in a second, to get your whole bean coffee. But they have the most amazing selection of loose leaf teas that you can find. Blue Eyes, I always tell tour guests, Blue Eyes is my favorite. It's herbal, it's got hibiscus, cream of rhubarb in it. It's amazing. Great place. And then, of course, you have Puerto Rico not too far away on Bleecker. Puerto Rico, now its own little coffee roasting and selling empire, has spots all over Lower Manhattan, roasting facility in Brooklyn. This is the original, started in 1907 by a guy named Patsy Albanese, an Italian who wanted to open a specialty shop for all of the Italian immigrants coming in, and then sold to the Longo family in the 50s. It's still in the Longo family today. And of course, if you haven't been, that's where you go to buy your whole bean coffee. As I tell people on the tour, my favorite is French cinnamon. It's a very dark roast. It's not as foofy, I like to say, as it sounds. It's very robust with a nice little bit of spice to it. But back around the corner, no, that's not Hercule Poirot from Agatha Christie that you're looking at all, although I think he looks just like him. That is Domenico Parisi. Domenico Parisi brings with it this idea of, with the Italian immigrants to New York, espresso, which was huge. Now, espresso comes over for the Italian immigrants living in that part of the village. This gentleman, Domenico Parisi, is cutting hair. And then he's selling shots of espresso with every haircut. And he realizes, I actually like doing this a lot more than I like cutting hair. So he takes $1,000, which was his whole life savings at the time, and he buys a monster of an espresso machine, a Vitero Arduino machine. But before we talk about that, I have a quote about how New Yorkers took to Italian coffee when it first came about. George Rector, who was a cookbook author and restaurateur at the time, said, "I have a great respect for what comes out of the Italian kitchen in general, but their coffee ought never to come out at all. They should use it to remove stains from copper pots." Espresso was so strong. New Yorkers, Americans hated it at first. Clem Paddleford, who actually wrote an article about Cafe Reggio that Domenico starts, says, "Coffee is the Italian espresso, black as an owl's nest at midnight. One sip burns your tonsils, two sips shines your shoes." But she loved, and this is actually her article, you'll see Clementine Paddleford, she loved the magnificent machine that Domenico had at Cafe Reggio, which is still open, well, today in some form right now. I'm not sure if they're doing takeout, but they are still alive and well. Very, very popular. That machine, only he sat at, only he operated. And he always, as you could see in this picture and the next, wore a hat. And of course, that was considered ill manners for people, for men inside to wear a hat. But he said it was out of respect for the machine. He didn't think the machine would run right if he did not wear the hat. And of course, he was the only one to touch it. That Vitero Arduino machine could pump out 1,000 cups of espresso an hour. Amazing. It was a monster. It made a thunderous noise, and it was the star of Cafe Reggio until Domenico introduces cappuccino to New Yorkers, which was, of course, a drink from Italy. Cappuccino, a shot of espresso with a little bit of milk and cinnamon, really set New York on fire. And Domenico said he was the first to serve it in New York. and we have it on the tour, and it's really good espresso. Uh, in 1958, he retires and sells the business off to the Cavalaccis. That's Hilda and Nilso, where it's her husband. Their son Fabrizio still runs the business today. Now take a look at that awning. You'll see in this picture that we took in the fall. That awning is still there, by the way, hanging on for dear life. And Cafe Reggio is still going strong as the original cappuccino. Inside Cafe Reggio is sort of like an interesting museum of sorts. Those paintings on the wall are from the School of Caravaggio. That ceiling fan hanging from the ceiling is reportedly from the set of Casablanca. And those benches that people are sitting on along the wall are from apparently the Medici family. But they let people sit on them. I don't know. There you go. And then, of course, there's the machine. It's not being used today to produce espresso, but it is there as a museum piece for everyone to see. By the way, when Domenico first bought it, it was coal burning, and then it got a natural gas hookup to it. Love this picture. That is Jackie Robinson and Bill Black. So for most of us New York coffee drinkers, we've probably heard of Chock full of Nuts, which was a New York company. Chock full of Nuts maintains its name from its original basically store in Times Square, where Bill Black opened up a nut shop, basically to sell roasted peanuts and other nuts to theater goers in the 1930s. He had 18 nut shops, but the problem was in the Depression, nuts were too expensive to buy. So he converts them into coffee shops, and the rest is history. By 1957, he's basically a national hit, a New York hit, and he hires Jackie Robinson to become his head of personnel. This is my favorite. I found a letter from Bill Black, basically giving everybody a 25-cent off coupon for instant coffee, which he hated. But because housewives liked the convenience of it, and soldiers who came back from war in World War II started preferring the taste of instant coffee to real coffee, which just boggles my mind. He said, here's a letter, here's 25 cents off. We won't kid you. We do not claim that our new instant coffee is as good as our regular coffee, even though it's made from the world's finest, most expensive coffee beans. I love it. He was so, and it was a hit too. And of course, Chock full of Nuts in the 90s was bought by Sara Lee, and they are still produced today. You can still buy it in the grocery store. And quickly, we've got the diner culture. And of course, that is a picture of George and Seinfeld. This is actually from the Super Bowl ad that ran, I believe it was last Super Bowl, inside the Real Tom's Diner in Harlem, not the one on the set, by the way. Diner coffee makes a hit in New York when the Greek wave of immigration hits. The Greeks came and they wanted, much like the Italians and the Jews, to have carts on the streets. But the city starts outlawing them because of the density of them. So Greeks go, well, we have to have our thing. And so they start making diners. And of course, the diner culture is what takes a big hit. And during the Depression, coffee is a meal. Basically, you buy a nickel for a cup of coffee, you put milk, you put sugar in it, and that's breakfast and lunch at the time. And that's when New York becomes that's when coffee becomes Joe. Mainly because of the average drinking man's beverage. It's also, the name Joe is also attributed to Joe Martinson of Martinson's Coffee, which was also brewed in New York. So on the tour, I'm very proud of this because, as we know, and we'll talk about right now, the most identifiable coffee cup in New York is called the Anthora. And the quote from the company when they ship me my cups that I give out on the tour is, if coffee were a religion, this would be its holy grail. And the man who invented it was this man. His name was Leslie Buck. He was a Czechoslovakian Holocaust survivor who emigrated to New York in 1962. He and his brother-in-law worked for the Sherry Cup Company. And the Sherry Cup Company, Connecticut-based, wanted the Greek diner contracts. So he comes up with a cup that is designed with the Greek signet on it in the Greek colors of the flag, blue and white. And he put something called the Anthora, which was a large vessel for holding liquids, on the side of it, and the pleasant words, "We are happy to serve you." And of course, there it is. Now, don't settle for imitations, please. This morning, I took a run. There's always a crushed up imitation Anthora on the street somewhere. It's not the real one. They ceased making the real one and selling it for mass distribution in the early 2000s. The real one is the front cup in this picture. The ones behind it are the replicas that are not real. Only one company now, they bought it from Solo, who bought it from Sherry in the early 90s. It's called the New York Cup Company, and they're the only ones who make the original. You can't see me at the moment, but at the end I'll show you. I'm drinking my coffee out of the Amphora, the original. There's a shot from Mad Men. Of course, when history buffs were doing their fact checking, Mad Men were holding their Amphora cup, the correct Amphora cups. Law and Order always had Amphora cups all over the set. And of course, the legendary cup itself. Now, quickly, how important cafe culture was in the 60s and the 70s. So this is Cafe Sino on Cornelia Street. And Cafe Sino, if you're a theater buff, started by a guy named Joe Sino, becomes the hotbed of subversive off-off Broadway theater. It becomes the home of off-off Broadway theater. It was recently landmarked. It's so newly landmarked, there is no plaque outside of it yet. There's a plaque inside. That is Joe Sino himself. He came down from Buffalo, basically ostracized from his family for being a homosexual. He comes down, saves up all his money, and rents the space on Cornelia Street from a little old Italian Sicilian woman, opens a very makeshift coffee shop, and lets his friends and then everybody in the village who sort of wants to workshop works, they get space there. They were not charged. They did not charge people to come in and see the shows there. Basically, your only charge was you had to spend $1 at the coffee counter. There is a shot of a performance in Cafe Sino. Sam Shepard gets his start here. John Guar workshop stuff here. A big patron, Edward Albee. So this was not just some hole in the wall where just anybody did theater. A lot of people got their starts at Cafe Sino. That's Joe Sino working the machine. He has a famous story where when he opened up in 1958, he also bought a Vittoria Arduino, but it didn't work, didn't have gaskets in it. So when he tried to brew the coffee, it just lumped up all over the place. So he had to run around real quick and get a bunch of coffee pots from people in the neighborhood. And he stealthily brewed coffee under the counter and made the noises to pretend like he was doing espresso. People loved it. Who else got their start? That is Bernadette Peters. Bernadette Peters' first performance was at Cafe Sino at its longest running show called Dames at Sea. So coffee houses were really pivotal to arts, politics, and just the general culture of New York. That is Cafe Sino today. It is an Indian restaurant called the Drunk Monkey, which you see that A in the window for its grade quickly became a undetermined, then they closed for a while, and then they don't have a grade. Don't eat there. But that is the original Cafe Sino, and inside behind the bar is a plaque to Joe Sino himself. So lastly, to wrap up, what is current New York coffee culture like? Well, this guy, Jonathan Rubinstein, has created Joe Coffee, which you may or may not know. Joe Coffee has 19 retail outlets in New York City, one of which in Grand Central Terminal. They also just opened up their own roastery in Long Island City. He was a frustrated talent scout who, after 9/11, decided he wanted to do his own sort of mom and pop deal. He opens the first Joe on Waverly Place using some money he borrowed from his parents. And quickly it becomes the hot spot for local Greenwich Villagers to buy coffee. The former Philip Seymour Hoffman loved it. Matthew Broderick. Amy Sedaris was baking cupcakes and selling them at his first location. And of course, now Danny Meyer has entered in a contract with Joe Coffee that every Danny Meyer restaurant and catering event will have Joe Coffee added. He has certainly made it. So one of the things each city now sort of has an identifiable, what we call third wave coffee purveyor. You've got Intelligentsia in Chicago, you've got Stumptown in Portland, you've got La Colombe in Philadelphia, and Joe is New York's coffee. Third wave is that idea of boutique coffee shops that scale up for a little bit more mass recognition. What Joe used to call his shops, subtitled Joe Coffee, the art of coffee, because he introduces to the New York scene latte art. Latte art being done on the West Coast for a long time before it gets to New York. Joe still, I believe, once a year hosts a latte art off contest in one of their locations where baristas sort of rally for who does the best latte art. And that is the original Joe's Coffee on Waverly, which we stop at briefly. We don't go in and consume coffee there because there's plenty of places for you to get Joe's in the city, but that is the first. I do talk about it. I love the look that that guy on the bench is giving us. Also, those benches now, they rebranded in November for that deeper blue and that new font. And the bench that that guy is sitting on is actually now part of the branding itself. And that is it. That is my presentation. And so now I welcome all of you to share their coffee brew or coffee story. I announce that I think here is my Anthora with my brew in it, which is a brownie. It's a local New York company called Brownie. Muted, Michelle. I'm back. So, questions. We could take questions. We could do your favorite brew. This is we're treating it like a big old conversation.
Who is the author of All About Coffee?
It's William Ukers. So William and then Ukers is Ukers. Another great book, and thank you for reminding me, sort of the seminal book, is The History of New York Coffee by Aaron Meister, Meister. Great, short read, but really comprehensive New York history book, coffee book.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. My pleasure.
Justin, what country produces the most coffee that's sold in America?
It was Colombia for a while. I do believe Indonesia has surpassed them at the moment. We are still getting most of our coffee from South America, but more of the Arabica blends that we are now tending to buy are from Indonesia, Asia area. Good question.
How often do you give the tours?
So actually, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, we give the tour once a week on Wednesdays, and then once a month on Saturdays or Sundays. It's a lot of fun. And so again, a lot of the information that I've given you is not even on the tour, just the tour is about more the purveyors themselves. I do talk about Alice Foote McDougall because we walk by her birthplace. But it's a lot of fun. We go in, you get espresso, chocolate-covered espresso beans. You get a cappuccino at Reggio, an espresso at this really great hidden coffee shop, which is behind a flower shop, which I don't even talk about in this presentation. Really fun. Love it.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Matthew Kingsley has a question. What led to the demise of practically all of the village cafes like Cafe Mona Lisa that we think of as the home of cafe culture?
Yeah, and so that's a really good question. And of course, there was the Figaro, there was the Dante, there was Reggio. Those were sort of the real grand dames of the original Italian coffee houses. The beats hung out there. It becomes a hot spot for NYU students. But what happens is as the rents go up, original owners either retire or pass away. And if they didn't own the spaces, they would be turned over to higher retail, unfortunately, which is much of the story of a lot of what goes on in New York City. Reggio was really lucky that they turned it over to a young family who kept it in the family, who then bought the space, which is why Reggio is one of the few. Cafe Dante, which was a huge one, was recently bought and turned into a cocktail bar. So a lot of them were sort of rebranding their images as well, which is ridiculous because Reggio's always packed. So if they would have kept their original sort of beat cred, they probably would have done all right. But
we have some nice words from Marcy Davis. Thank you.
Oh.
And there was a question from someone regarding how to tip you, Justin.
Oh. How to tip? That's a good question. I do have a Venmo, but I don't remember. We'll send an email. Thank you. We'll send an email out. You don't. I do this because I love it. Our guides are really hard at work when they do this. We encourage you to tip them, but you don't have to tip me.
Justin's on our staff, so.
I'm on staff, so I'm doing okay right now.
Anyone else have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourselves. Oh, Alyssa Seslow says, thank you so much for doing this. Does anyone serve anything other than Arabica or Robusta, if I pronounce that?
Yeah. So actually, if you go to, there's a very, very interesting enough, Puerto Rico has that monkey poop coffee. Every once in a while, they will brew it. If you go to Puerto Rico, they do have a sort of a shifting cycle of brews that they'll do from some of the other beans that they have, more exotic. I'm forgetting the name of the one that they do more often, but there's a little counter at the back of Puerto Rico in the Village location, and I think at the East Village location, where you can get different than Arabica and Robusta. As a matter of fact, most cafes are barely doing Robusta anymore, just because it's really hard to regulate the quality of the flavor. It tastes rubbery. But Puerto Rico is a good bet.
All right. If there are no other questions, we'll wrap up for today. Thank you so much for joining us once again. Oh, Justin has
pleasure to serve you.
Pleasure to serve you. This afternoon, Village Preservation, formerly Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, always a handful of words to say, is inviting our insiders to join their talk about women and modernity in Greenwich Village. So that should be great. And Friday, they're also hosting a chat with their executive director, Andrew Berman. And next week, what do we got going on?
I'm back on Tuesday doing underground subway.
That's right. So Justin, the originator of also our subway tour, among other things, is going to go over a version of that tour. And then we have a talk also with Museum of Eldridge Street and the Jewish Forward Archives next Tuesday afternoon. So that should be great. They're going to bring out the actual plates, I believe, of the newspapers and show us that. And then there will be one more talk with Village Preservation on one of the first women doctors in America who was working in New York City. So that's next week so far. We added some new tours, virtual tours today of Riverside Park. So please sign up and join us for that. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
See you next time.
Happy coffee drinking.
Same to you.
Bye.